So it's now really time to finalize this form and this overall overlay here. For that, here in this last row where I have these two buttons, I also want to add a third button, a drop-down button that can be used to select a category. So therefore here, in this row, next to the buttons, I'll add this drop-down button widget, which is offered by Flutter, which renders a button that will display a drop-down once clicked. Now this drop-down button widget then has two arguments that must be set. The onChanged argument, the onChanged parameter, as always for these buttons, must be set to a function that should be executed when the button is pressed. Though here it really is a function that will get a value of type dynamic, because the value that it will get here will simply be the value that has been selected from the dropdown, and it's of type dynamic because Flutter right now does not know which kind of items will display in this dropdown. Because that's the next part. Items now wants a list of drop-down menu item values. Now in this app here, I of course simply want to display all these possible categories in this drop-down menu. And for that, we can reach out to our category enum, which is available because we're importing this expense dart file in which this enum is defined. And on that enum, you can not just access the different values that you defined, but actually also a values property. So a property named values, which gives you a list with all the values that make up the enum. And that's what we need here because we want to display all these values in this drop-down list. Now values is a list of enum values, a list of categories therefore, and items wants a list of drop-down menu items. Therefore, we have to do something we did before in the course already. We have to call map on this list to transform it from one type of value into another type of value. Now map, as you learned before in the course, wants a function which will be executed automatically by Dart for every list item. And we will get the list item for which the function is currently executed as an input value automatically passed in by Dart. So here it will be a single category, since this function will be invoked for all the category items. And we want to return our drop-down menu item here. So drop-down menu item. That's what we want to return here. Now drop-down menu item in the end is a widget. And it is a widget where we have to set the child parameter to another widget, which simply defines what will be shown on the screen. And here I'll keep this simple and simply output a text widget here, and the text value should be this category. But category, of course, is of type category, so our enum type here. And to convert this to a string that can be output with the text widget, we have to access the special name property that's made available by Dart, along with a couple of other properties on all those enum keys, all those enum items. And name then has a toString method, which we can call to convert these enum type values here to strings that can be used with the text widget here. So the values property on the enum itself was a property provided by Dart, and the name property on the individual enum items is another property provided by Dart. Now here we're still getting an error in the end that we have an iterable here in a place where a list is expected, and therefore we should do something we did before in the course as well. We should call toList on the result of map. But this is actually not all I want to do here. Instead, on this drop-down menu item, I don't just want to set the child, but in addition to that also the value parameter. And this will be the value that will be stored internally for every drop-down item. It will not be visible to the user. it's this child that's visible to the user, but it will be stored internally, and it will be this value that we get here in this onChanged function whenever the user selects one of these drop-down items. And here the value is the category itself, so the specific enum item that is mapped to a specific drop-down menu item. So therefore here in onChanged, Flutter now understands that the value we will get here will actually be of type category. It will be one of these enum items. And then we can use this here, and for the moment I'll just print it. Of course, in the future we'll do something else with it. But with that, if we save everything and force a reload, if we open this, we have this drop-down button here, and in there we find our different items. Though as you see, when I select them, we actually don't see them here. We also have no initially selected item, and they're also all written in lowercase. So there are a couple of things we have to do here. And the first thing is to get rid of toString. We actually wouldn't even need that because name is already a string, but I want to replace it instead with toUpperCase. Because this is a built-in method that can be called on strings that transforms a string to be all uppercase. So that's the first step we should take. In addition, I now want to store the value that was selected, because just to quickly show you this, if you do go to the debug console, you can indeed see the different selected values there. So printing worked and selected worked, but I also want to store the values now so that we can later use them when our form is submitted. And for that, we can't use a controller. Dropdown button does not support a controller, but we can of course manage this manually by adding another new variable to our new expense state class, just as we added selected date there to manage it manually. And here the value will be of type category, of course, and I'll name this selected category. And initially, I'll set it to category leisure. So that's the selected category variable. And now, of course, this should be updated whenever a new value is selected. So with help of onChanged here. Alternatively, we could also create a new separate method at which we point here, but here I'll do it just in place and call setState to set selected category equal to value. Now value could be null. It has this question mark here, and that's the problem Dart has with this code here, because maybe the user didn't select anything. And therefore I'll add a little if check and check if value is equal to null. And if that's the case, I will simply return. And we can do this outside of setState actually. So that this code here only executes if the value is not null. Because if we return in a function, no code thereafter will be executed. A return statement is always the last code that will be executed. So therefore, if we return here, if the value is null, this code won't be executed. And on the other hand, if this code will be executed, we know that the value will never be null. And Dart now also understands this and no longer complains. So now that we're storing selected category and we're updating the state whenever it changes, we can also tweak this drop-down button and actually add the value parameter to it and set this to selected category. And with that, we ensure that the currently selected value will be shown on the screen instead of showing this empty drop-down as it was the case before. With that, if you save that and force a reload again, now you see that leisure is selected initially, and if I switch to a different category, that is shown on the screen instead. And you also see that it's all written uppercase, as mentioned before. So that's looking really good now, and therefore there are now just some tiny adjustments left. For example, I want to add a spacer between my drop-down button and the other buttons, a const spacer, to make sure that there is some spacing between all these buttons. And I also want to have some spacing to the top, so some space between the amount input and this drop-down, for example, some vertical space. And for that, of course, we can go to this place here before we start that row that contains the drop-down button. and here add a sized box, a const-sized box with a height of 16, for example, so that we have some distance here. Now with that, we made good progress. We're almost done here, but not entirely yet. User, I of course want to make sure that if we try to save some empty input fields, we fail and we show the user some error message that tells the user that valid input values have to be entered first. And of course thereafter, I also want to make sure that this list is updated and the new expense is added to the list keyboard before we then thereafter take care about styling and the chart. And last but not least, related to this form here, or to this overlay, of course, if you tap into one of these fields, you see that the keyboard is coming very close to these input fields. And it might actually obscure these input fields on some devices. So we also want to make sure that that will never be the case. But we'll start with validation.